Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 176, 10 points from Gryffindor. As November began, the weather turned bitterly cold, and every morning a layer of frost covered the ground. Overnight, it seemed the Black Lake had developed a thick, hard layer of ice, and many students were already venturing onto it to play. The moment they stepped out of the castle's warmth, Kyle and Cedric felt a biting wind whip against their faces. "Ah, it's freezing." Cedric shivered. "Good thing I switched to my heavy robes a few days ago, otherwise, I'd probably catch a cold just walking out here." Last year, he'd waited too long to swap robes and had ended up spending 3 days steaming from the effects of Madame Pomfrey's potions. Her remedies worked fast, but they always came with odd side effects. "We'll probably warm up once we start training," Kyle said, pulling his collar tighter as he quickened his pace against the chill. "You're probably right." The two walked across the field to the Quidditch pitch. They were early, and on the pitch, Harris was busy moving boxes of Quidditch balls to the side. Kyle also spotted Hagrid, bundled in his long moleskin coat, de-icing the broomsticks. When Hagrid saw Kyle, he waved enthusiastically and called out, "Hey, Kyle. Training today, are you?" "Yes, Hagrid," Kyle replied, walking over and pulling out his wand. Scourgify. In an instant, all the frost on the broomsticks disappeared. "That's handy," Hagrid said, eyeing Kyle's wand with a hint of envy, his gaze drifting to the small pink umbrella in his pocket. His wand was concealed inside it, but for some reason, he couldn't openly use it around others. "Anything else I can help with?" Kyle asked. "No, thanks." Hagrid picked up the brooms and added with a grin, "If you ask me, you ought to train after lunch when it's a bit warmer." "Nothing we can do about it," Kyle sighed. "Today's the last weekend before the competition, and all 3 houses want to practice." If he had a choice, he'd prefer to train in the warmer hours, but unfortunately, Harris was too agreeable. With just a bit of flattery, he had accepted the earliest time slot. As a result, Ravenclaw reserved the pitch for 4 hours starting at 10, and Gryffindor claimed it afterward, leaving Hufflepuff with only the early morning hours. "Looks like everyone's taking this year's matches seriously," Hagrid observed. "But I'm sure you'll win, you lot were last year's champions, after all." "Of course, I think so too," Kyle said with a confident smile. Around then, the other team members arrived at the pitch. Kyle bid Hagrid farewell and soon joined his teammates for training. Since today's practice was just routine and not a tactical drill, Harris didn't close off the pitch. About half an hour later, spectators began trickling into the stands. Most were Quidditch enthusiasts who, upon seeing they could come and go freely, were eager to catch some action before the season officially started. Right on the dot at 10, Harris, who'd been leading the practice for 2 hours, signaled the end. The team descended from the air and handed the pitch over to the Ravenclaw team, who had been waiting eagerly. Kyle followed his teammates back to the castle. After a short while, the spectators reluctantly filed out of the stands, clearly annoyed at having to leave the match's atmosphere behind. But as it was nothing new, after a few quiet grumbles, they wrapped their arms around themselves against the cold and trudged back toward the warmth of the castle. Noticing their shivering forms, Kyle's face grew thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" Cedric asked, noticing Kyle's faraway look. Kyle replied, "What would you say to making a warming charm device?" "A warming device?" "Yes." Kyle gestured toward the students rubbing their arms for warmth. "The temperatures dropped fast lately, and it'll probably be colder on the day of the Quidditch match. If we could create a portable warming device, it'd be a hit." Cedric hesitated, mulling over Kyle's idea. "What you're saying makes sense, but there's something you might not know. Last year, during the match, we used the hot air charm and the warming charm to deal with the bad weather. Both of those spells are covered in 3rd year. Kyle, however, was unfazed by Cedric's concerns. His target audience wasn't the older students, but rather those in the first and second years who hadn't learned those charms yet. That would be enough. With their plan in mind, the two quickly found Kanna and the twins to discuss the idea. Cho couldn't join them as she had her own practice to attend. The five gathered in an empty classroom and brainstormed until noon. "It's a deal, Kyle," Fred said excitedly, standing in the doorway. 2 months of waiting. Finally, we can get started. George waved a hand with enthusiasm. "You know, I've been looking forward to this since the start of the school year. It seems I overheard something interesting." A cold, sinister voice suddenly echoed from down the corridor. Fred and George froze, turning around quickly to see Snape and Filch standing at the corner, both eyeing them with ill intent. "It's you two again, and this time I've caught you," Filch said with evident satisfaction, glaring at the twins. "Time and again, breaking school rules, and still you show no remorse." He looked over to Snape with a grin. "How about we throw them in the dungeon to teach them a lesson? Those chains I've got down there are in prime condition, just waiting to be used." Snape said nothing at first, but his expression darkened as he noticed Kanna standing beside Kyle. His gaze became even more severe. Making a lot of noise in the hallway, 10 points from Gryffindor, Snape snapped, approaching with a pronounced limp. His icy glare landed on Kyle. "Now, tell me what foolish scheme you're all planning." If looks could cast spells, Kyle would probably be surrounded by a swarm of Sectum Sempra curses right now. "I think you've got the wrong idea, Professor," Kyle replied, shifting uncomfortably under Snape's gaze. "We were just talking about next week's Quidditch match." "You'd better be," Snape said, his eyes narrowing. "Because if I find out you're lying, or breaking any school rules, I'll see to it you're expelled." Kyle forced a thin smile, feeling a dull ache in his jaw. He couldn't understand it. Shouldn't Snape be focusing his attention on Harry? Why did he keep singling him out? "Well, why aren't you talking?" Snape's frown deepened as he looked at Kyle in silence. No respect for a professor. Gryffindor will lose 10 more points. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 177, The Bluebell Flame's charm. Snape limped away, and Filch, noticing, could only follow with a sigh of disappointment. He had hoped, just this once, that he'd get the chance to restore the dungeons, but it seemed like another false hope. "This isn't fair," Fred exclaimed, scowling in the direction Snape had gone. There were 3 Hufflepuffs there, but he only docked points from Gryffindor. "It probably just slipped his mind, don't worry about it," Kyle said, patting Fred's shoulder. "On behalf of all Hufflepuffs, I'd like to express our sincerest thanks to Gryffindor." Fred placed a hand on Kyle's arm, mimicking his serious tone. "In return, Gryffindor would like to make a humble request." "Not a chance," Kyle replied without hesitation. "Hey, I haven't even told you what it is." "Doesn't matter. We'll get to that later," Cedric interjected, frowning. "Did anyone notice that Professor Snape seems to have a leg injury?" "We figured that out days ago," George replied with a shrug. "During potions, he barely moved at all, and he usually walks around a lot. This time, he just stood there." "From that, we guessed something must have happened to his leg," added Fred. "And we even saw blood traces on the floor of the potions classroom, but no one had been hurt that day." Fred and George quickly shared the clues they'd noticed. "No wonder he's been scarce lately," Cedric said, puzzled. "But doesn't it seem odd? This is Hogwarts. Why would Professor Snape be so badly injured?" "Who knows," Fred mused. "Maybe he went to the Forbidden Forest. I heard he goes there often to collect ingredients for potions. Could have run into a dangerous magical creature. Or he went to the restricted area," George suggested. "Remember on Halloween, when all the professors were hunting down that troll? Maybe he got too close to the 3-headed dog." As they talked, the group made their way down the corridor. Snape and Filch were already gone, but none of them wanted to risk them suddenly doubling back. To avoid any unnecessary trouble, they decided to head in different directions. The twins turned toward Gryffindor Tower, while the others split up at the stairwell. Kyle and Cedric headed downstairs to the Hufflepuff common room, while Conna, mentioning something she needed to do, peeled off to the library. The following week, Kyle became even busier, as did the others, who were now spending at least an hour a day in an empty classroom, working on their new products. Finally, by the second week, the Quidditch tournament began. That morning, the weather was clear and cold, and the dining hall was filled with the tantalizing smell of sizzling sausages. Everyone was excitedly chatting about the upcoming match, anticipation buzzing through the hall. "The first match is Gryffindor against Slytherin," Cedric said, munching on his toast as he checked the schedule he'd made. "They're the opener, and then we play Ravenclaw." "Gryffindor." Mikkel, seated next to him, mused. "Their seeker is that first year, Potter, isn't it?" Hogwarts was never short of secrets, and despite Wood's best efforts to keep it under wraps, word had spread that Harry had been made seeker. The news that a first year, the youngest in a century, had been given such a coveted position had made Harry a school-wide topic of conversation. But opinions were mixed. While some thought Harry would excel, others were skeptical. Malfoy, from Slytherin, had repeatedly sneered that Gryffindor would have to follow Harry around with mattresses to catch him when he fell. Everyone else was curious if Harry would succeed, but Malfoy seemed only concerned about him falling. Either that, or Malfoy and Harry had a peculiar affection for each other. The group looked over to the Gryffindor table, where Harry sat with a frustrated expression, surrounded by a group of students trying to get him to eat. Each was offering him a sausage, toast, or something else, as though to make sure he didn't face the match on an empty stomach. "He looks really nervous," Mikkel observed. "That's how it is for first-time competitors." "Well, for most of them," Cedric said, breaking off mid-sentence as he noticed Kyle, calmly eating toast as usual. He was also a first-time competitor, yet he looked entirely unfazed. Just then, Fred and George strode into the hall. Rather than sitting down to eat, they wandered about for a bit before leaving. Noticing this, Kyle, Conna, Cedric, and Cho from Ravenclaw quickly finished their breakfasts and followed them. They tailed Fred and George to the entrance of the Quidditch pitch, where a wooden shelf had appeared, lined with all sorts of cheering props, each glowing blue. The display included bottles that emitted a lion's roar and snake-shaped glow sticks that floated in the air. The pulsing blue light seemed to radiate warmth, dispelling the morning chill. The closer they got to the shelf, the cozier it felt. "Bluebell Flame's charm, brilliant idea," Fred remarked, touching the shelf. "At least the younger kids won't have to freeze while watching the game." The Bluebell Flame's charm was a special spell. Despite having flames in its name, it was only about 50 degrees Celsius, warm enough to hold comfortably. The flames themselves looked like delicate, glowing bluebells. "Everything's set," George said. "We need to get to the stadium early, so we probably won't be able to help out here." "That's fine, leave the rest to us," Cedric said with a grin. Fred and George weren't expected to help today anyway, as they'd already turned down that role. Cho took a seat next to the shelf, sighing contentedly. "Honestly, it's really comfortable here." Only now did Cho understand why Kyle had chosen this spot for their sails. The warm, flickering blue flames created an oasis of comfort, transforming the cold, drafty corridor into something entirely different. Soon, the match was about to start. Fred and George were called to the changing rooms by Wood, and students began trickling out of the Great Hall and toward the pitch, eager to watch the game. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 178, Hermione's frustration. This year's Quidditch season caused a stir twice before the first match had even started. The initial buzz came when Kyle set a new record, scoring 21 goals in just 10 minutes, sparking a fresh wave of enthusiasm for Quidditch across Hogwarts. Before that excitement could die down, even more sensational news broke. Harry Potter, the famed boy who lived, and the one who had defeated the Dark Lord, had been made the youngest seeker in a century. Harry was already popular, and with this new role, it was clear this year's Quidditch matches would be livelier than ever. Half an hour before the game, the stands were already packed, with students filling every seat. Not even the biting wind could dampen their excitement. This thing actually works, Malfoy remarked in surprise from the Slytherin stands. He looked down at the little snake wrapped around his arm, glowing blue and radiating a pleasant warmth. And each time he lifted his arm, the snake would hiss toward the Gryffindor stands. The only problem was the sound, soft enough to be drowned out by the cheers around him. Across the pitch, Gryffindor's roar was so loud that it could be heard even from within the castle. Why isn't there a premium version? Malfoy grumbled. Beside him, Goyle quickly chimed in. Kyle said there wasn't enough time to make it. Goyle had a small glowing snake wrapped around his arm as well. I heard you, no need to remind me, Malfoy snapped, then said loudly, and he promised he'd bring what I wanted for the next Slytherin match. It'll be bigger, more flexible, and in the Slytherin colors, silver and green. Hearing this, the young wizards around him grew excited. Many of them came from wealthy families and would gladly pay for better cheering gear. Draco, isn't this kind of thing a lot more complex than a map? One of them asked doubtfully. Can Kyle really pull it off? He's only a second year. Of course he can, Malfoy replied confidently, raising an eyebrow. He already promised me. Meanwhile, not far off in the Hufflepuff stands, Cedric found himself asking the same question. Kyle, can you really pull off what Malfoy's asking for? It's a bit of a hassle. Kyle replied, frowning, but it's doable. It'll just take some time. The things they had sold before were mostly just glass bottles with a few sound effects, nothing overly complicated. But Malfoy's list of demands couldn't be met with transfiguration alone, these would have to be crafted as genuine magical items. Still, for 100 galleons, Kyle figured the extra trouble was worth it. Cedric caught Kyle's drift, whistling in admiration. The wealthy Malfoy family didn't hesitate to shell out 100 galleons for a cheering prop, an amount that exceeded Cedric's father's monthly salary. Soon after, the professors arrived, Professor McGonagall, Professor Snape, and even Professor Sprout, who typically stayed in the greenhouses. Nearly the entire school, aside from Headmaster Dumbledore, was gathered around the Quidditch pitch. Students in the back rows clutched binoculars, and some seats had been magically lifted to give better views. When the two teams finally emerged from the tunnel onto the field, the Gryffindor stands burst into cheers at the sight of Harry Potter in his team uniform, followed by thunderous roars from enchanted lion heads. That thing is amazing. Ron muttered to Hermione, casting an envious look at the blue lion heads held by Neville and Seamus. You should really get one of those. No need, Ron, Hermione replied, shaking her head. It's just a simple Bluebell Flames charm and a transfiguration spell. Not worth 15 sickles. Besides, I already made you one, didn't I? It's different, Ron mumbled, looking down at the jar Hermione had crafted for him. It gave off a comforting warmth but couldn't make a lion's roar. Kyle had said the heating function was just an added perk that didn't even count as money. Seeing Ron's dissatisfied expression, Hermione's temper flared. She snatched the jar from his hand. If you don't want it, give it back. A gust of cold wind swept past, and Ron, too surprised to react, shivered violently. Blimey, it's freezing. Hermione. Ron began. Humph. Hermione turned away, still fuming. In truth, Hermione knew that the heating jar she had made was nothing like Kyle's creations. She had tried multiple times on the way here, and while she could manage the transfiguration spell, her jar lacked Kyle's finesse and couldn't produce any lion's roar. The gap in skill was already disheartening, and Ron's ungrateful look felt like salt in the wound. With no other option, Ron scooted as close as he could to Neville and Seamus to catch some warmth from their lion heads. The game began with the referee's whistle. Look, the quaffle has just been seized by Gryffindor's Angelina Johnson, announced Lee Jordan from the commentator's box, having been chosen as this year's new Quidditch commentator. However, after just one sentence, Lee veered off topic. What an outstanding chaser that girl is, and she's also very attractive. Jordan, came Professor McGonagall's stern reminder. Sorry, Professor, Lee replied, and the crowd burst into laughter. Kanna, watching from the stands, glanced over at the commentary box. This year's commentary seems a bit different, doesn't it? She remarked. Can't say I'm surprised, Kyle chuckled. Lee's friends with Fred and George, so you can't expect a typical commentator. Cedric nodded in agreement, then paused as a thought struck him. Wait a minute, I'm friends with Fred and George, too. Back in the stands, Lee Jordan continued his commentary, skillfully balancing humor and play-by-play. Though he occasionally threw in flirtatious remarks, his commentary was lively and engaging, adding a new flavor to the match. The audience quickly warmed to his style. It may have been less traditional, but it certainly made the game all the more entertaining. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 179, The Frenzied Fluffy. 5 minutes into the game, the first goal finally arrived. It was Angelina from Gryffindor. The cheers from the stands exploded like thunder, echoing through the cold air. Kyle joined in with the applause, just like everyone else. As Lee Jordan had said, Angelina was an excellent chaser. She'd just broken through Slytherin's defense as if she could actually soar, making it look effortless. But just as Kyle was about to clap again and refocus on the match, a large, fiery red bird suddenly appeared, gliding through the crowd and landing on his shoulder. Fox. Kyle looked at the phoenix on his shoulder, surprised. What was going on? Did the headmaster's bird enjoy watching Quidditch too? He'd never heard of that. The young wizards around him were equally stunned. Cedric's mouth hung open in awe, as if he might start drooling as he stared at Fox. This is a phoenix. Yes, yes. Cedric suddenly exclaimed, springing up excitedly and gesturing with his hands. It's a phoenix. It looks exactly like the one in the book. Calm down. Look at you, you're such a dork, Kyle muttered, giving Cedric a disdainful look. It's just a phoenix. What's the big deal? Cedric shrugged. Easy for you to say. This was his first time seeing a live phoenix. Kyle, meanwhile, had taken out a handful of Dibney leaves and offered them to Fox. Can't watch a Quidditch match without snacks. But to Kyle's surprise, Fox didn't eat them. Instead, he shook his head and whispered something into Kyle's ear. What the? Kyle frowned. Fox wasn't there to watch the match, he was there to deliver a message. Dumbledore wanted to see him. But the match had just started. Seeing Kyle hesitate, Fox gave him a sharp peck on the head. All right, don't pull my hair, I'm coming. Kyle said, standing up. What's wrong? Kanna asked, curious. Kyle leaned over and whispered, the headmaster wants to see me. I have to go back to the castle. The headmaster? Yeah, this phoenix belongs to him. Do you need any help? Cedric offered. No, you guys keep watching the match. Kyle gave the pitch a reluctant glance before making his way through the crowd and heading quickly toward the castle. The path was empty, and as they walked, Fox relayed the reason Dumbledore had sent for him. Once back at the castle, Kyle went directly up the stairs to the restricted 4th floor. Dumbledore was already waiting for him there, along with Hagrid. Professor, Hagrid, Kyle greeted them, frowning. Fox told me that Fluffy went berserk. I'm afraid so, Dumbledore said gently. I'm sorry, Kyle, this may mean missing part of the match, but right now you're the only one who might understand why this happened. That's all right, Fluffy's my friend, too, Kyle replied, shaking his head. Can I see him now? Of course. Dumbledore opened the door, leading Kyle inside. In the room, Fluffy lay sprawled on his back over the trapdoor, sound asleep. Some necessary measures, Dumbledore explained. If he were awake, he'd attack everything around him like a mad creature, and keeping this door closed would be nearly impossible. I understand, Kyle nodded, then approached to carefully examine Fluffy's massive, unconscious form. He noted that there were no wounds, Fluffy's fur was intact, which ruled out any external trauma. Kyle frowned, beginning to sense why Dumbledore had called him here. "Professor, can you wake Fluffy up?" he asked. "You'd best prepare yourself, Kyle," Dumbledore replied, his expression serious. "Trust me, a frenzied three-headed dog is far more terrifying than you might imagine. It's fine, as long as you're here, I'm sure I won't get hurt." "That may be the finest compliment I've received," Dumbledore chuckled. "The last time I felt this proud was when I became headmaster of Hogwarts. Now, step back." Dumbledore raised his wand and tapped its knobby end. Fluffy's eyes snapped open. Roar. The furious roar thundered through the room, making the ceiling tremble and sending dust raining down. Muscles tensing, Fluffy sprang up, lunging directly at Kyle, who stood nearest. In an instant, Fluffy's three massive jaws were open, revealing rows of yellowed teeth, each head snarling with raw fury. But then, suddenly, chains appeared out of thin air, binding Fluffy's neck. Another chain materialized, then another, until a total of 6 chains had wrapped around Fluffy, securing him tightly. No matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't move an inch further. The violent thrashing caused the chains to cut into his flesh, embedding deeply. "Oh!" Hagrid clutched his chest with a groan, as if he could feel the chains tightening on his own body. "Please! Dumbledore, please!" Dumbledore remained resolute, his gaze fixed on Kyle. Fluffy continued to snarl, and Kyle tried to speak to him, though it seemed futile. With no other option, he focused intently on the sounds of Fluffy's growls. Because Fluffy was only semi-conscious, his growls were disjointed, but Kyle noticed certain words repeated. "Death, kill. Hagrid. Revenge." Fluffy's desperate struggles intensified, staining the chains red as the room filled with the metallic scent of blood. Hagrid clamped a hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. He seemed to want to approach and comfort Fluffy, but as soon as he moved closer, Fluffy snapped at him, nearly catching his arm in a vicious bite. Dumbledore pulled Hagrid back just in time. As Fluffy's injuries worsened, Kyle finally spoke up. "That's enough, Headmaster. Stupefy." A dazzling flash lit up the room, and in a blink, the chains vanished. Fluffy crashed into the wall behind him, sliding down before collapsing with a heavy thud. Hagrid rushed over, applying essence of Dittany to Fluffy's wounds, his face lined with worry. Dumbledore looked at Kyle. Before he could ask, Kyle spoke up. "If I'm correct, Fluffy's acting this way because he wants revenge, for Hagrid." Dumbledore's blue eyes flashed with understanding. "Revenge? For Hagrid?" Hagrid turned around, looking startled, his tear-streaked face confused. "But I'm fine. He even tried to bite me just now." "That's what's so strange," Kyle said, frowning. "It's as if Fluffy believes you're dead and sees us all as your murderers." Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 180, Fear Curse. A heavy silence settled over the restricted area. Dumbledore appeared deep in thought, his head lowered, while Hagrid instinctively touched his chest, as if to reassure himself that he was indeed still alive. "You're saying Fluffy thought I was dead, and that's why he went berserk?" Hagrid asked, scratching his head in confusion. "Yes, that seems likely," Kyle replied, then turned to Dumbledore. "Professor, could it be that someone used the Confundus charm on Fluffy? Given the three-headed dog's high resistance to magic, a typical charm would be as effective as a tickle. But it all depended on the caster. For instance, under Dumbledore's magic, Fluffy was no stronger than a rag doll, a simple stunning spell had easily put him to sleep." "It's possible," Dumbledore replied after a pause. "But I don't think it's a simple Confundus charm." Kyle frowned. "You mean there's another charm on Fluffy besides the Confundus charm?" "Yes, and it's dark magic," Dumbledore confirmed, stepping forward to examine Fluffy more closely, his nose almost brushing the dog's fur. Then he tapped his wand gently on Fluffy's middle head, muttering, "Just as I thought, the fear curse. The fear curse? Hagrid gasped, clearly unfamiliar with the term. Yes. Technically, it's not considered classic dark magic. It only appeared about 50 years ago, so it's understandable that you haven't heard of it. Straightening up, Dumbledore asked, Kyle, do you know what a boggart is? Of course, Professor, Kyle responded. It's a magical creature that shape-shifts to match the worst fears of anyone facing it. Dumbledore nodded. Precisely. This dark magic is inspired by the boggart's nature, he explained, a grim edge to his voice. It creates illusions, trapping the victim in a constant vision of their greatest fear. It seems someone cleverly combined the Confundus charm with this dark magic, inducing Fluffy's current state, he added. Kyle nodded thoughtfully, beginning to understand. The fear curse had made Fluffy see Hagrid's death over and over, tormenting his mind, while the Confundus charm made him perceive everyone else as a murderer. Kyle felt a flicker of relief. If Dumbledore hadn't detected Fluffy's condition in time, and if Fluffy had managed to escape into the castle. Kyle shivered, unwilling to imagine the potential disaster. Almost all the professors were at the Quidditch pitch, only a few students, disinterested in the match, remained in the castle. Encountering a crazed Fluffy would have meant an instant and brutal danger. Hogwarts itself might have been forced to close. Thankfully, Dumbledore had intervened in time, preventing the worst from happening. Kyle exhaled deeply and asked, Professor, do you have a way to lift the curse? A solution? Dumbledore's eyes glinted briefly. It's actually quite simple. Just, no, Dumbledore. Hagrid suddenly burst into tears, rushing toward him. Please, don't kill Fluffy. He's a good boy, please. Hagrid, you've misunderstood, Dumbledore said, looking up at the sobbing Hagrid and patting his arm comfortingly. I never intended to kill Fluffy. Really, truly? Hagrid asked, clutching his chest as he choked back sobs. Absolutely, Dumbledore chuckled, I promise. Though killing Fluffy would indeed have been the simplest solution, it was never in Dumbledore's plan. In this entire situation, Fluffy was the most innocent party. Once Hagrid had calmed down, Dumbledore continued, as it happens, before I became headmaster, I spent some time studying the fear curse and understand it quite well. Turning to Kyle, he added, but for now, Kyle, would you mind taking Hagrid to the hospital wing? Dumbledore winked. I believe he could use a good night's sleep. Kyle nodded and led Hagrid from the room. It was clear Dumbledore didn't want them around for what was to come next. Hagrid kept glancing back every few steps, reluctant to leave. Oh, and one more thing, Dumbledore called from inside the room. Hufflepuff earns 50 points. Once they left the restricted area, Kyle accompanied Hagrid to the hospital wing. Hagrid was hesitant to go but didn't put up much resistance. His thoughts lingered on Fluffy's suffering, leaving him so distracted that he nearly stumbled down the stairs several times. Dumbledore was right, he really did need a good night's rest. When they reached the hospital wing, Kyle briefly explained Hagrid's condition to Madame Pomfrey, though he chose not to mention the details of what had happened in the restricted area, only saying that Hagrid was deeply shaken. Madame Pomfrey took one look at Hagrid, who was standing with his head bowed, and without pressing for more information, she pulled out her wand and enlarged a bed in a quiet corner. Then, she retrieved a bottle labeled Draught of Living Death from a cupboard, pouring its contents into a wooden bucket about the size of a quaffle. She repeated this twice more until she had filled the bucket, then handed it to Hagrid. Lie down on that bed over there and drink this, she instructed. Hagrid took the bucket and, as he lumbered over to the bed, managed to knock over a few others along the way, earning a disapproving look from Madame Pomfrey. Fortunately, Kyle hurried to set the beds back in place, so she held her tongue and simply gave him a brief, pointed reminder before heading off. Not long after, the sound of Hagrid's snores filled the hospital wing, and Kyle exhaled in relief, drawing the curtain around Hagrid's bed to give him some privacy. Leaving the hospital wing, Kyle made his way quickly across the courtyard. Looking in the direction of the Quidditch pitch, he sighed softly. The sky above the pitch was empty now, and he could see a large crowd of students heading back toward the castle. Clearly, the match had ended. Kyle rubbed his forehead. He had anticipated this outcome. It seemed that ever since last year, every time there was an important Quidditch match, he was destined to be swept up in some sort of chaos. He'd hoped this year might be different, but it appeared things would remain the same. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.